All right, well, it is one, so we'll go ahead and get started. Well, I'm sure we'll have some folks coming in to join us for our session, Inclusive Summer Reading, Making Your Library and Programming More Accessible. I am excited to introduce my colleague at the Department of Libraries, Karen Gravlin, who is the Library Consultant for Inclusive Services and Director of the ABLE Library, which is Vermont's Library for the Blind and Print Disabled. Thanks so much for joining us, Karen.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's all yours. And we'll help monitor the chat and give plenty of time for questions.
Thank you. So as Jonathan mentioned, my name is Karen Gravlin. I'm the director of the ABLE Library, and I have a dual role with the Vermont Department of Libraries. So I'm also the consultant for inclusive services. And I've been in this role for about 2 years. And prior to that, I worked in public libraries for several years. So just a quick verbal description of me. I have brown hair past my shoulders, pale skin, and brown eyes. I'm wearing a gray sweater today, and I have a headset on. My background is blurred, so you can't really see anything behind me. But on the slide is a drawing of a girl lying on her stomach holding an open book, and above her are the words "All Together Now," which is this year's theme for the Collaborative Summer Library Program. So first, thank you all for joining me today to talk about inclusive summer reading. I'd like to start by saying that while I work closely with people with disabilities, I'm always learning something new, which I think we all do when we're focusing on being more inclusive. So finding ways to make your library and programs more accessible is really an ongoing process. And when we're doing this kind of work, we're going to make mistakes and we're not going to get it right all the time. But I really do believe that most people appreciate when they see that you're making a genuine effort to make them feel more welcome in your library and to show them that you're trying to find ways to include them. So it is definitely a worthwhile endeavor. So with that in mind, all of the information I'm giving you today are things that I've learned from serving people with disabilities directly, other professionals I've worked with, other libraries that are doing amazing work, as well as my own research. And this information is always changing. So what we think of as inclusive or accessible today may not be in a few years. So it's just something to keep in mind. And just briefly, my personal approach to providing library services to people with disabilities is to do my best to follow the motto, "Nothing about us without us." And how I interpret that is including people with disabilities in the conversation about how to provide more inclusive services, and also understanding that we shouldn't be adopting policies or programs without the input of the people those policies and programs will affect. So that means listening to what patrons with disabilities are saying they need from the library, as well as noticing who's not coming to the library and why that might be. And then hopefully using that information to do our best to try to meet those needs and reach the folks who aren't coming in. So I try to make sure that patrons feel welcome to share their feedback. And when they do, I try to acknowledge their feedback and incorporate it into my library services if I'm able to do that. I really think adjusting something we're doing based on patron feedback whenever possible is a great way to build relationships with patrons and make them feel, allow them to feel some ownership of the library. So the program ideas or collection ideas I'm talking about today may not work for your community, and I encourage you to work directly with your patrons and community to be, really thoughtful about what services they need and what you can provide. And you'll be constantly redesigning your services and programs and sort of building on what you've learned and the feedback you've gotten, which I think is basically what we all do as librarians anyway. So for today's agenda, I'm going to do just a quick overview of disability in our society and why it's important to have that basis of understanding. We'll discuss simple ways to make your library environment more accessible to your patrons, and then we'll get into the details of making programming more accessible. I'll go over what the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled has planned for their patrons this summer, and what their network libraries around the country are doing and how that might be helpful for you. And then we'll end with some tips on accessible collections. And just so you're aware, you're welcome to participate in a way that feels comfortable for you. So you can use the chat, unmute yourself, or turn on your video. Whatever way is easiest for you works for me. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat, and Jonathan can chime in if I miss anything. I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end, but I invite you to stop me anytime if you have something you'd like to ask or get clarification on. So I'd like to start by talking about some statistics around disability. So the image on this slide, which is from the Centers for Disease Control, shows an outline of the United States, and it's filled with human figures. And you might notice that some of the figures are blue and some are yellow. So the blue figures represent the number of adults in the US who have a disability. And the data in this image states that 61 million adults in the United States live with a disability, which is equal to 26%, or 1 in 4 adults. And we can break that data down further. We know that 13.7% of adults in the US have a mobility disability, which means that they have serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs. 10.8% have a cognitive disability, meaning that these folks have serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. 6.8% have a disability that affects their ability to live independently, which means that they have serious difficulty doing errands alone, like visiting a doctor's office or the library. 5.9% have a hearing disability, which refers to deafness or serious difficulty hearing. 4.6% have a visual disability, which means that they are blind or have serious difficulty seeing even when they're wearing glasses. And 3.7% have a disability that affects self-care, which refers to difficulty dressing or bathing. And these numbers are just about adults in the US. When we're looking at the statistics for children with disabilities, the National Center for Education Statistics reported that during the 2020-2021 school year, 7.2 million students nationwide, ages 3 through 21, had a disability that adversely affected their academic performance and were eligible for special education. That's approximately 15% of total public school enrollment. So the reason why understanding disability and focusing on accessibility in our libraries is important is because we're all affected by disability to some extent. Potentially 1 in 4 adults who walk through our doors have a disability, and about 1 in 6 school-age children who come to the library have a disability. And I really think that we should be doing what we can to make sure that these patrons have access to library materials and services. So let's talk about how we view disability as a society. So there are many definitions of disability depending on whether you're looking at a dictionary. The ADA has their own definition, Social Security has one. So there are a lot of legal considerations when we try to define disability. So I'm not going to try to define it for you today. If you're curious about it, there are resources out there that you can use to explore those definitions further, and I'm happy to connect with you afterward if you have an interest in that. Instead, I'm going to talk about how our society views disability and give you a sort of framework to highlight the different ways that we think about disability. And in this context, it's helpful to think about 3 different models or perspectives in understanding disability. So the first model I'll talk about is the moral model. So from this perspective, we view disability as a reflection of a person's character or their actions. So you might run into people who think that a person with a disability, quote unquote, deserved their disability, either because of something they've done or something someone in their family has done. I was recently reading a book about World War I and how prior to that war, people viewed facial disfigurements as a sign that you were a bad or evil person, which people thought would be the only reason why God would inflict that punishment on you. And they thought that if you tried to hide it, that you were trying to deceive people into thinking you were a good person. And unfortunately, that held true for many other disabilities as well. And to some extent, I think that we as a society like to think that we're sort of above this kind of thinking now and that we've evolved, but there are still so many examples of it. So when you think about the media that we consume, I think about the Joker in basically any Batman movie. His mental illness is what makes him evil. Or we have villains like Captain Hook, who's actually named after his disability. A real life and more difficult example is a condition like fetal alcohol syndrome. So I know many people have seen a child with fetal alcohol syndrome or heard about them and then judged the child's parents because of it. And I think it's easy to forget that society tends to view that child and their condition as a reminder of decisions that were made by other people, which can unfortunately lead to a lot of shame and guilt. On the other hand, we sometimes see disability as a sign that you're a good person. So even today, when we think about disabled veterans, we honor them because they carry a visible reminder of having survived and sacrificed for their country. So it can go both ways in this model. The second model is what is often referred to as the medical model or the clinical model. So in this view of disability, the disability is seen as a deviation from a quote unquote normal body that needs to be cured. So from this perspective, medical professionals might be focused on fixing a person and trying to get them to as close to normal as possible. Another way to think about it from this model is that disability is an individual problem that needs to be solved, and it doesn't really take social or cultural factors into account. So in this model, medical professionals work for a way to fix the patient, and then the only role for the person with a disability is to want to be as normal as possible. And I'm not suggesting that all medical professionals today feel this way, but this is one framework that our society has used and continues to use to think about disability. And understandably, this has led to conflicts between the medical community and the disability community when a doctor wants to find a cure for a disability, but the patient isn't necessarily interested in a cure. So for instance, cochlear implant surgery can be a controversial topic for many people. Some people are proud to be part of the deaf community and they're proud of being deaf, and they don't necessarily view deafness as a disability or feel the need to be cured. And then there are other people with hearing who might not understand why someone would choose to continue to be deaf if they had the opportunity to be able to hear. So there is a tension there. And the last model I'll go over is the social model of disability. So when we're trying to understand disability from this perspective, we view disability as one aspect of a person's identity, just like gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. So this model asserts that it isn't the disability that limits a person's activities. Instead, it's the environment that's limiting their activities. And that by modifying the environment, we eliminate the barriers a person with disabilities faces in that environment. So to an extent, this is the model that we use when we think about disability rights and advocacy. This model is the reason we have things like curb cuts, ramps, automatic doors. These are all examples of us modifying the environment to reduce barriers to access. This is also the model I'm using when I talk about making library programs accessible. So we're trying to change our programs to eliminate barriers for people with disabilities who want to participate. And this really just highlights how complicated it can be, because I think we all, to some extent, view disabilities with all three models at one point or another. You can provide things like curb cuts, but still, show respect for a veteran with a disability, or hope that your friend who has cataracts gets surgery, to improve their vision. So these frameworks aren't meant to show us that there's only one right way to view disability. I think they can just help us understand why we might think or act the way we do about disability. And maybe sometimes we change our minds about certain things when we think more honestly about why we feel the way that we do. So before we talk about programs, I'd like for us to think about how people with disabilities access our library buildings and experience the library space. So on the slide, I've included a picture of a beautiful red brick library building with a ramp that leads to the entrance. When we talk about making our buildings accessible, I know that the first thing that comes to mind for me is money and time. So a lot of libraries don't necessarily have the resources to bring their building into ADA compliance all at once. And maybe you don't even have the authority to make that happen. So I'm not here to tell you that that's what you need to do, or that you should go tell your director or board that you need to install an elevator and it needs to be done before summer reading starts. This is an area that would be best covered by talking to an ADA expert to see what requirements your library needs to meet in order to be ADA compliant and what the best way is to go about doing that. But there are relatively easy and manageable things that you can do to make your library space more accessible. So I'm not going to get into addressing physical changes your library building might need, like accessible parking, ramps, or bathrooms. Those are all important in ensuring that your building is accessible. But for today's purposes, I'm going to talk about things that I kind of think of as the equivalent of soft skills when it comes to accessibility. So in other words, these are actions that library staff can take that are relatively low lift with the potential to make their space more welcoming for people with disabilities. So the first is to consider a behind the scenes tour of the library. You can plan a program before or after hours where you invite patrons with disabilities to visit the library in a really low pressure environment. So why should you consider offering this? In the case of children, maybe the parent or caregiver is worried about being disruptive or being the negative center of attention. Maybe their child doesn't do well in new places and large crowds. Maybe a blind person feels more comfortable getting to know the library building without so many people around. So this can be a way to control the environment a little and allow folks to explore the library and get to know some of the staff in a less stressful way. And I've never personally had the opportunity to offer a before or after hours tour to patrons, but we did find ways to schedule visits from adult daycare centers or special education classes at times of the day when we knew the library wouldn't be too busy. So we would let library staff know ahead of time so that they knew what to expect and that the patrons visiting the library with this group might engage in behaviors that staff might not be used to, or that they might need more assistance than some of our other patrons. So even if you can't offer a tour while the library is closed, there are ways to try to plan visits at a time when you can maybe be a little more accommodating and control the environment a little more. Another way to introduce the library in a very low stakes way is to create a social story about the library. And for those of you who might not know about social stories, these are little booklets or packets that can help show a new patron what the library looks like and what to expect before they visit. So social stories were originally created to help children with autism, but just like other accessible features that we've sort of adopted over the years, I think they have the potential to help other people as well. So the first page of your social story might have a picture of your library's entrance, and the next page might have a picture of the circulation desk and talk about how that's where you can check materials out. And the third page might be a picture of the children's room with a brief explanation that says, this is where you can find children's books, movies, toys, etc. You might also use your social story as an opportunity to encourage certain behaviors. So for instance, if you're showing a picture of a quiet study area in the library, you might say, this is our quiet study area. People can use this spot in the library to read quietly, and we make sure not to make noise in this area, or something along those lines. And the idea is that the social story makes the library a more familiar place for people and provides them with examples of what to expect and what kinds of things they might do in the library, as well as what's expected of them. Another relatively easy way to make your space more accessible is to simply have information about your library's accessibility on your website. And hopefully your website is accessible, but that topic could be a presentation all on its own, so we won't get into that today. But just for a quick thought exercise, have you ever looked at a restaurant's menu online before you actually went to the restaurant so that you could pick what you wanted ahead of time, or so that you could make sure that they had food that you like? Or have you booked a flight and then used the diagram of the plane to choose a seat near the restroom because you hate walking through the entire plane to get to the bathroom? Those are simple and convenient ways that businesses use their websites to show their customers what to expect. And libraries can use their website in the same way. So does your library have a ramp for wheelchair access? Do you have an elevator? Is your signage in Braille? Do you have a staff member who knows American Sign Language? Are there accessible parking options? Do you have an accessible restroom? So these are all things that someone with a disability might go to your website to find out. And sometimes when you don't have that information listed somewhere, it makes them less likely to visit the library. So even before they've stepped foot in your building, if you don't have that information available, it can feel like you aren't taking people with disabilities into account, even if that's not the case. If you're in a wheelchair, would you make the trip to the library if you weren't even sure you could get in the door? So basically, a patron with a disability might think, if they didn't even care to put this information on their website, what can I possibly expect when I visit in person? And if you are interested in looking at ways to make your library building more accessible, the last thing that I'll mention is the ADA checklist for existing facilities. So you can use this checklist to kind of take stock of where your building is with accessibility. And if you have capacity and you want to be as accessible as possible, running through this checklist can show you the places and ways that your building is not accessible. And doing that can at least give you an idea of the challenges a person with a disability might face when they're trying to use your building. Knowing this information can help you not be caught by surprise when someone with a disability has issues with accessing spaces or resources in your library. And understanding where those pain points are can help library staff find ways to mitigate them and to anticipate the assistance that patrons might need from them. So hopefully you can make plans to address any accessibility issues that come to light from going through the checklist, but having that information can allow your library to show your patrons with disabilities that you've taken that first step and are looking for ways to make sure the library is accessible to everyone. But regardless of where your library is on creating a more accessible space, there are steps that you can take to make your programs more accessible. And before I talk about some of these tips, I just want to emphasize that I'm not a lawyer and I'm not qualified to provide legal advice. So if you need information on what your obligations are around meeting ADA requirements and providing accessible programming, I highly recommend reaching out to the New England ADA Center. The things that I'm mentioning are just some suggestions to help you start thinking about ways that you can be more inclusive in your programming. So again, I'm going to go back to the social story. Creating a social story about your program may seem like a lot of extra work for just that one program, but I think that it can be beneficial for a couple of reasons. So firstly, the social story makes your program more accessible for folks with certain disabilities. So they can get an idea of what to expect, what their behavior should be, and what kind of experiences they might encounter in a program. And that can help them make an informed decision about whether or not they want to attend. You could inadvertently help someone avoid a negative experience at the library. It also helps to ensure that the people who do attend understand what they're supposed to be doing during your program, which will hopefully lead to better audience participation and behavior. But secondly, I think it helps you plan the program. If you're going through step by step to create the social story, then you're really thinking about that program. Where will people sit? Will there be tables and chairs? Where will the presenter be? Will they need a microphone? What supplies will you have on hand, et cetera? So it gives you a roadmap of how you want to set up for the program, and it gives you a kind of run of show. So in the event that you have to miss work that day, someone else can use your social story to make sure the program still runs smoothly without you there to coordinate everything. But even just creating a social story for recurring programs like Storytime would be helpful. And of course, there are certainly aspects of the social story that can be reused, like the picture of your program space or the kinds of behavior that you expect from patrons at a program. So you don't have to recreate the whole thing every single time. Another aspect of programming I want to mention is marketing. So if you're using print marketing materials like flyers, are you using a font that's easy to read? Is the color contrast enough so that people with visual disabilities can read it? If it's on your social media, do you have descriptions of any pictures you've posted for people with visual disabilities? You might also consider creating a simple video that explains what the program is so that people who can't read for whatever reason still have access to that information. And that might be a good project for an intern or a volunteer, especially if you have teen volunteers over the summer. But one of the most impactful things you can do when you're advertising a program is to make sure to include a statement of welcome in your advertising. So the question mark symbol that I have on the slide is the information symbol, and it's just a question mark with a circle around it. And it specifically indicates that people with disabilities can get more information on how to access accommodations for your program. So typically, you would put the symbol on your program flyer next to your welcome statement that lets people know that this event is for everyone, outlines what accommodations you're already planning to offer, whether that's closed captioning, an ASL interpreter, et cetera. Contact information for anyone who needs to request an accommodation, as well as a time frame for making the request. So you might say that all accommodation requests need to be made at least 7 days in advance. And that's just to give you time to put a plan in place to meet that request. And this can be uncomfortable for some libraries because they're worried that this will open a can of worms, so to speak. They're not sure that they can meet the accommodation request, or they don't know how to meet an accommodation request. And I just want to say here that not having this information available won't stop people from making accommodation requests, and it won't change your obligations to meet a request, but it does make it easier for your patrons with disabilities to reach out to you. And if you're nervous, that's where the New England ADA Center can come in. They have a great service where you can call or fill out a form on their website with any questions related to the ADA. It's confidential, and they can give you great information on what your obligations are and resources on how to proceed with an accommodation request. And sometimes it's as easy as talking to the person making the request to kind of clarify what they need. Maybe they just want the program materials in large print or Braille. Maybe they're hoping the presenter will have a microphone to make it easier for them to hear. It might be that they're just asking you to save some space at the front of the room for a wheelchair. So having the symbol and information on your marketing material just lets patrons know that you're open to having the conversation and working to make sure that they have access to the program. I've also seen libraries add an accessibility symbol to the programs that are meant to serve patrons with disabilities, like Sensory Storytime, on their online calendar. So the accessibility symbol is on the slide as well, and it looks like a stick figure holding its arms out like it's doing jumping jacks with a circle around it. And adding this symbol can help patrons see at a glance which programs might work best for them or their children or the people they're caring for. It's also a great way to model inclusivity to your community. Any patron visiting your programming calendar can see that accessibility is important and that the library recognizes that and offers accessible programs to the community. You might also consider offering special supports during programs. So one way to do that is to talk to the presenter ahead of time, and if they're okay with it, you could let patrons know that moving around, humming, rocking, etc., are all welcome behaviors during the program. You might consider offering sensory supports for patrons as well. So these could include things like lap weights, fidget toys, noise-canceling headphones, blankets and pillows. And you might offer these items in a sensory break box that you can make patrons aware of at the beginning of the program and show them where to get it if they need it. You could even dedicate a corner of the room with those items already set up so that patrons can visit that corner when they need to take a break and then can rejoin the group when they're ready. I also just think it's a much more positive interaction to offer the patron an opportunity to spend some time in the sensory break space until they're ready to rejoin the program than asking them to step out, which can sometimes feel like a punishment. I'd like to mention the possibility of providing a program schedule and/or instructions in accessible formats. It can be helpful for some patrons to know what the schedule for your program is as it's happening. So you might consider a written schedule and one with pictures. Written or picture instructions can also be helpful for folks. Having information in multiple formats allows patrons to access the information in a way that works for them. And sometimes it can be helpful for people to hear the information and then see it as well. So having those different options is a good thing. Other things to consider when you're planning a program is what kind of supplies you have available and how the space is set up. So if you're running a craft program, do you have scissors that can be easily held by someone with a disability? Crayons or markers of varying thicknesses are helpful, or offering other accessible writing tools with like ergonomic grips or egg grips. If you're having patrons cut something out, you could use glue to create a tactile outline for people to follow. And as far as room setup goes, making sure presenters are using a microphone, offering visual elements for people with hearing disabilities, and providing spaces for wheelchairs are just a few things that you can consider. And at the start of your program, a helpful thing to do would be for you to announce what accessibility options are available to your attendees. So for instance, before you introduce your presenter, you might talk about welcome behaviors during the program, like rocking or humming. And then let everyone know that the presenter will be using a microphone, that there's space up front for wheelchair access. Let them know where your sensory break corner is, and mention that closed captioning is available if that's, if those are the features that you're offering for that particular program. So not only does that let patrons with disabilities and their caregivers know what's available for them, but again, it also models what inclusivity looks like for other patrons in the room. So let's talk about some concrete ideas for programming that are more accessible for folks with different disabilities. So when you're planning a craft program, you could consider offering process-oriented, open-ended crafts rather than a product-oriented craft. So if you're not sure if your program is process-oriented or product-oriented, you can think about the finished product that patrons will have in hand at the end of your program. And if you can show people an example of what it should look like, then your program is probably, but not always, product-oriented. And when someone has a disability that prevents them from being able to create that product, it can be frustrating and alienating for patrons. So in process-oriented crafts, you let your patrons be the drivers, so to speak. So maybe you run a painting activity, and instead of focusing on what they will paint, you could provide different materials to paint with. So maybe you encourage patrons to use their fingers, toothbrushes, popsicle sticks, whatever you have on hand. And then, bonus points if the tools you offer to paint with provide, different tactile experiences for people, which can add another layer of participation for patrons. So the image on the slide is a programming space in a library, and there's a mural on the wall of creatures that live in the ocean that were created by patrons. So this picture was taken by my coworker at a library we were visiting last summer. And patrons used available materials to create all kinds of different examples of sea life. This was a process-oriented activity that let people sort of engage in whatever way worked best for them. So there were people who drew directly on the mural. Other people colored a ready-made image or used stickers. Some people cut out and glued paper together to create their creature. So there's a really diverse representation of different ways that patrons were able to participate in this craft. Another idea I saw for last year's summer reading program was to use trash to create an artwork of some kind. So participants could use items that would have been thrown away and then create whatever they wanted with them. And just like I mentioned about having supplies like crayons or markers of varying thicknesses, that can apply to other program materials as well. So for instance, if your program includes making friendship bracelets, do you have beads of varying sizes for people who struggle with dexterity? Clay or Play-Doh can be another great program material that's accessible for folks with different disabilities. So these examples are sort of meant to just give you some ideas of ways that you can adapt your craft programs. And because these types of programs are open-ended and usually involve various materials that people with different abilities or disabilities can use, these programs can also be a great way to involve people of all ages and have it be a more multi-generational program, if that's something your library is interested in offering. So just thinking back to the mural in the picture, an adult could create a beautiful seahorse while a young child might color in an image of a fish that was already printed out for them. So when you let patrons engage with a craft like this, you can really open it up to a wider audience. Another programming option involves open structured activities or play. So you can kind of see that there's this theme of letting go of the end product. It doesn't have to matter so much what people have in hand at the end of your program. It matters more that they are able to participate and learn throughout your program. So CSLP offered an online training session, I think it was a year or two ago, that talked about child-directed play experiences at the library. And there's a link to the recording in my slides if you want to watch that yourself. But providing your patrons with supplies, giving them some guidance, and then letting them engage with the supplies in whatever way they want can really allow for people with disabilities to participate in a way that works for them. So one of the examples that the training gave was that the library collected cardboard of all kinds and then had a program where children were told to build some kind of structure from the materials at hand, and then they could play in them or decorate them. And again, the picture on the slide shows some tables in front of that sea life mural. And on the tables are some Legos and a sign that you can't read, but it says, "What can you build with 20 Legos?" So this would be an example of an open structured activity. Patrons can engage with the Legos however they want. There's no expectation that they'll have a that they'll, have produced a certain product at the end of that activity. So, maybe someone builds a tower out of all the green Legos, and maybe somebody else builds a house. You could also offer other programming where the librarian provides some more structure than the programs you've just talked about, but then allows the patrons to decide on the content. So for example, maybe you're offering a program to teens on junk journaling, and you provide the guidelines on what a junk journal is and how they're created, and you provide the materials and supplies, but then let your patrons decide what content they want to include in their journals. So some of the teens might create their own artwork to include, and others might focus on a particular theme, like a favorite band, and include quotes or pictures. And other people might want to pick a topic like flowers and create more of a collage in their journal. So in the end, they all have a similar product, which was the journal, but they've all sort of put their own spin on it and created it in a way that worked for them. So this would let someone with a disability who might have a difficult time writing, they could use stickers or glue pictures into the journal, or maybe a patron with a visual disability could choose items with different textures to include in theirs. Music therapy has also been gaining in popularity with libraries. So these programs can help patrons develop language skills, like through singing, motor skills by playing an instrument or dancing, as well as cognitive skills. And activities can include listening to music, playing an instrument, singing, exercising. Music therapy can be used to facilitate social interactions or relaxation. Patrons of all ages can benefit from these types of programs, and there are certified music therapists who run them, so they can tailor the program to meet the needs of a specific patron group, depending on what your community needs. I also think it's important to just offer programming where children can interact and socialize with other people who have disabilities. It's also important for their parents and caregivers to be able to connect with others who are caring for people with disabilities. So just providing the space and the time for people to create community can be a valuable program. So you could provide some sensory toys or stations for the children to engage with so that caregivers have time to interact with each other. You might even consider partnering with a special educator or a speech language pathologist to come answer questions from caregivers during that time. You could also use this program as a way to model for caregivers how to engage their children in appropriate activities for them. And the last programming sort of the idea that I'll mention is take and make programming. And I know a lot of us became really familiar with this format during the pandemic, but I think that this option allowed patrons who might not have participated in the past a chance to try out a library program. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable attending an in-person program, or they couldn't, or they were worried that they wouldn't be able to complete the project in the allotted time. So whatever the case, I know when we were offering take and makes at my library, we saw patrons we had never seen in person coming to take them. So we definitely reached people we hadn't in the past. And libraries even added virtual programming to supplement the take and makes by giving patrons a chance to grab the supplies ahead of time and then attend a scheduled virtual program so a librarian could walk them through the activity or craft. So this just can offer patrons another accessible way to participate. I know that summer reading primarily focuses on kids, but I also know that there are a lot of libraries that are working to make summer reading an all ages program. So that's why I've included some thoughts on providing accessible programs for adults. So the picture on the slide just shows the bodies of two people who are both holding open books without their heads. And all of the same sort of advice applies that I've already mentioned, making sure you're marketing your programs with accessibility in mind, setting up the room, offering special supports, all of those things. But one program you might consider offering is adult story time. And if you're not comfortable doing this on your own, you could partner with staff at an adult daycare center to talk about what types of services they need, the stories and crafts that might work well for their group. Inviting a group from a daycare center can be an easier way to start off a program like this because the center can bring the adults they serve to attend the program, and they can send staff who can assist and keep track of how it's going and keep it all moving smoothly. So that option might be a low lift way to get the program off the ground. Offering adapted programs is another way to be more inclusive. So this might involve working more closely with presenters than you're typically used to. So for example, your library might offer an adult program on emergency preparedness for patrons. You could then also work with the presenter to adapt the programs for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities so that they have an opportunity to hear the same information, but just delivered in a way that's easier for them to understand. Another example of adapted programming is what Jefferson County Public Library in Colorado, they offer a monthly program called Library for All, and it's meant for adults with disabilities to make crafts and create art and play games. So using some of the ideas I discussed for children's programming, like process-oriented crafts and open structured activities, would work well in this type of program as well. You could also consider offering a book club for patrons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Next Chapter Book Club is an organization that partners with libraries to provide training to facilitators to run the program. So when the book club meets, a facilitator reads a portion of the book to the group and then they discuss it. And this method can be a great way to include patrons who may not be able to read. And if running this program takes too much bandwidth for a smaller library, or you just don't have the capacity to do it, you could also partner with another organization so that they facilitate and maybe you just offer the space to hold the book club. You can also look at ways to make an existing book club more accessible. So making sure the book that you've chosen is available at your library in large print and audio format is a great way to start. You could also check to see if the book's available at your state's library for the blind and print disabled to offer that as a possible format for eligible patrons. And then consider sending your list of questions out ahead of the meeting so that patrons have an opportunity to review them. Another program that's meant for people with dementia to attend with their caregivers is Memorable Times Cafe. So my library co-hosts a program like this with a partner organization that serves older adults. And in this program, we pick a theme for the month. So a few months ago, we talked about sports. So we had pictures of sporting events and famous athletes. We played songs about sports. And all of this was just to help prompt people to talk about a sport they like, or maybe a sport they participated in when they were a kid. So it's just a great way to engage people with dementia in conversation and have some fun together. So these are just some ways to provide programs for adults with disabilities. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, and there are many other programs you could consider providing, but hopefully this gives you some inspiration. I think one of the strengths of librarians is that we usually know when we're not an expert and can use our network to find the experts we need to provide resources and services to our patrons. So this is just a reminder that you don't have to be the expert in providing accessible programs to your patrons. Partner with other organizations to provide what your patrons need. So schools can be a great partner in providing accessible programs. If you can get connected with special educators in your community, they can tell you what students in your area might need and work with you to tailor your programming accordingly. They can also promote your programs and collections to their students and their students' parents. Schools might have other professionals who may be interested in assisting with your programming, whether it's acting as a consultant and sort of auditing your programs for accessibility, or coming in as an expert at a program to work with patrons or caregivers. Parents and caregivers are also great resources. Excuse me. Talking to them can give you an idea of what they need and the people they care for, what they need as well. So one example is that I worked at a library that offered sensory story time based on patron feedback, and we couldn't figure out why we weren't getting great attendance, because we had so many people tell us it was a need and that they wanted to come. And then when we finally talked to some of the parents, we found out that there was another organization that offered a sports program for kids with disabilities on the same day and time. So a lot of the families who would have come to sensory story time had another commitment. So talking to parents and caregivers can give you insight and information you wouldn't find otherwise. And then, of course, you can find ways to partner with other community groups and organizations. So I mentioned earlier the possibility of partnering with an adult daycare center or organizations like Next Chapter Book Club. There are also councils for independent living and other organizations that serve people with disabilities who may either have some idea of what the needs are in your community and how the library can help meet those needs, or who may have experts who can help you run programs or be presenters at your programs. So these organizations might also be able to audit your library or programming and identify ways you can be more inclusive and accessible. So really my point is you don't have to be an expert and you don't have to do this work alone. So there are other options for patrons with disabilities to participate in summer reading programming. For those of you who may not know, the Library of Congress offers a service called the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled, also known as NLS. So this program provides support and resources to network libraries across the country. And every state offers this program through a network library. So any US resident with a visual impairment or physical disability that prevents them from being able to read standard print, as well as people with reading disabilities, qualify for this free service. And for the first time ever, the NLS is offering a summer reading program this year. They're following the CSLP theme, and they plan to host, I think it's 7 separate events throughout the summer. They're going to have a kickoff event. I know there's going to be author talks for different age groups, as well as a music program. So these programs will be available to any NLS patron of all ages in every state. So because they're providing these programs to people around the country, they will be virtual. And since these programs are geared towards people with disabilities, they're very cognizant of providing verbal descriptions, captioning, and handling accommodation requests. And in addition to the programming, NLS will have a dedicated summer reading webpage with things like craft ideas, reading lists, and sample logs. Some NLS network libraries in different states run their own summer reading programs. I know many of them follow the CSLP theme, but some of them do iReads or they do their own. And the programs are very similar to what public libraries offer. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because you might have patrons who qualify for this service, and this programming might be a great way to supplement what you're already doing with your summer reading program and just provide some more options for your patrons with disabilities. So if the purpose of summer reading programming is to promote reading and learning over the summer, then while one component is definitely the programming, the other is offering reading materials like books. So it's important to provide accessible collections when possible. I know a lot of libraries already do this with large print, audiobooks or even graphic novels. I would encourage you to think about the different book formats you're already providing to your patrons and just make sure that you're aware of how those different formats might serve people with disabilities. For instance, you probably already recommend large print or audiobooks to people with visual disabilities, but you might consider offering large print books to patrons with a reading disability because sometimes the larger print and more space between texts can be helpful. Or maybe, offering magazines or short stories to people with cognitive disabilities who have trouble remembering things because the shorter format might be easier for them to engage with. So you don't necessarily need to go out and create a new collection. You probably have a lot of materials in your current collections that are helpful formats for patrons with different disabilities. One collection that many libraries already have that I like to mention is your DVD collection. DVDs can be accessible formats if you're aware of the features they have. Some DVDs have closed captions and some of them have audio descriptions, but we should make sure that they're noted in your MARC records or that it's otherwise easy for patrons to find that information. If you're offering streaming services, do you know if the platform you use offers captions or audio description? Making these items findable can be so helpful for patrons and staff. A more non-traditional collection that's been popping up in libraries over the last several years are sensory toy collections. So sensory toys are meant to stimulate one or more of the 5 senses. They can allow children to engage with their preferred sense, and they can also allow children to explore their other senses in a safe setting. However, these toys can be cost prohibitive. So some libraries are now offering them either as a collection to use at the library or as items that can be checked out by patrons. And these collections can also offer caregivers a chance to see which toys might work best for their child, and then they can consider purchasing them themselves. Another collection you could consider offering are story boxes or story kits, and I have a picture of that on the slide. So with these, you start with a book, and for the sake of ease, I'm using Goodnight Moon since most folks know the book. And then you include some tactile items that are part of the story. So maybe you have a comb or a brush, socks, mittens, maybe a balloon that a child can blow up and keep. These kits can offer children different ways of experiencing the story and allow them to use different senses to engage with it. The last thing that I'll talk about for collections is considering a collection that features disability. So that might be, it might be that you're collecting books for parents who are supporting children with disabilities. Maybe it's picture books or chapter books that center a character with a disability, or it might be books to learn about a certain disability. And even if you can't create a separate collection, making sure these items are easy to find in your catalog and featuring them regularly in displays can be another way to support your patrons with disabilities. So the last couple of slides are a list of resources, including programming and collection resources, as well as examples of social stories and behind the scene tours. But if you remember nothing else about this presentation, keep the New England ADA Center in mind. They're such a great resource, and they can help guide you in situations so that you're doing the best you can to make your library services accessible. I can't recommend them highly enough. And then finally, keep the National Library Service and your state's network library in mind as well. If you know of patrons who might benefit from this service, you're welcome to refer them, or you can even get them started with an application yourself. You might even be able to partner with your state's network library to provide a display in your library, or a program or other resources you can share with your staff or patrons. Each state in New England has a network library, and they're all listed on the slide. So you can, with links so that you can get to your library's network library, your state's network library, and be able to connect with them. And that's the end of my presentation. So the rest of our time is open for questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, unmute yourself, or turn on your video. I see that there's some.
Yeah, there's a few. Thanks so much, Karen. That was really, really great. There's been a lot of good feedback happening, and I just reminded folks that that the slides are available in the tote bag, and then you can access all of the links that are there.
Yes,
and we were putting a few links into as you were talking, which are probably some of the same ones that you have here. A lot of comments here. I know that there was one. There's a question when you mentioned junk journals.
Oh,
someone was wondering what that was.
Sure. So,
which I have like I wanted to hear from you, because I was like, I can search it, but I'm like, I want to hear you.
Oh, you're going to make me.
Yeah.
So as far as I am aware, a junk journal is just sort of a journal that it's kind of like scrap journaling, except that you might use like things from traditionally, I think what you use are like found things. So, you know, if your grandma has a bunch of postcards, or I know wallpaper is a weird thing that people like to collect and put in their junk journal. So it's in its purest form, it's stuff that you just find and you can like scrapbook it into a junk journal. But I think that people have sort of co-opted that and created their own sort of things, which is why I was mentioning, you know, like people can put in their own artwork, or, you know, a collage of things that they're interested in. So it's just, I guess, in my mind, it's just another word for a scrap journal.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and it was one thing that like that I had on my mind too, that I put in the chat, is that a lot of the process art, open play, and the junk, like those are all great for all the reasons that you discussed of being open and not having this end product in mind. But it also is just great from a supply, like a perspective of being able to like go into a closet, which every library has a closet full of junk, and being like,
Right.
all right, here's a bunch of stuff. Let's like put it out
Do what
and
you
like
will.
see how people can
Yes.
and see how people can use it, or like these random you know, toys and blocks and things that we can put out and have open play.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? Karen?
I don't
I
see
just-
any. Oh,
Oh, go
I
ahead.
just want to say, I just want to like say ditto to that, because I feel like a lot of us as educators or people that work in libraries always have like these kind of neat and tidy little ideas of, you know, projects and how they're supposed to turn out. And even for people who are not necessarily identified or identifying as having a disability, find that to be, you know, kind of frustrating sometimes. And
right.
so I
Yes.
love that you're highlighting that, as because I myself, you know, think of myself as like a, you know, like, oh, open-minded person, but then I created this program called Passport to Music. And then as I'm thinking about it now, I'm thinking, oh, I did have like, they were supposed to make this thing that looked like a guitar at the end and be able to play it. And now I feel like, well, that was limiting, you know, maybe I need to edit or like, you know, revise that so it's a little more open-ended.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey Karen, I had a thought. My daughter has narcolepsy and cataplexy, so that's considered an invisible disability, and they
Right.
often inline it with things like diabetes and other things like that. And she has like a 504 at school, but a lot of the stuff is being able to move around, which you've already addressed that, being able to like having something to draw or do things like that. But I was thinking about the diabetes, and I was thinking there's so many different kinds of disabilities that we don't necessarily know about, that it's possible, like, do I need to have snacks in the library, or do I need to have
Right.
like, what, you know, and so it's an interesting thing just to think broader. So I love that you brought up this. I mean, I think, I don't know if I told you this, but we had, when I worked for Audubon in Massachusetts, just assessing like the access like of walking in, like, you know, we think that like gravel paths or like just a wheelchair is hard to get over gravel, you know, like there's
Right.
different things that we don't even think of. And I love in the chat somebody said bringing an ABA, I think it was a dumb parent. We had a person, she went to the different Audubon centers, and she's got, you know, wheelchair and walking, like her husband's in a wheelchair and she's got like walking sticks, and the two of them went to different sites and assessed it. So I don't know it, maybe that's where we go to some of the resources that you mentioned, to see if they'll come and do a site visit and assess what we have. But it is kind of really eye-opening to even think out of that box, out of what we're normally like thinking
and
we're
it's-
doing a good job, and then, oh
Right.
wait, we could do
The
So-
mentioning of the snacks is a huge thing, because I know there are so many libraries where you're not allowed to eat in the library.
Yeah.
And there are people who need to, you know, on a pretty regular basis in order to keep their
Yeah.
blood sugar at a good level. So yeah, that's a great thing to consider.
Yeah, and even if it's like a designated space for
Right.
that, even if it's not the entire library, I know that some libraries have that.
Yeah. I love the sensory box. Somebody also mentioned sensory toys. If you do have a link to that, I would love to know about that. Since we're joined with the school, I know sometimes I have substituted for the school librarian, and I know they have para educators or special educators that are with their kids. But when I'm in the library, when kids come to, you know, our programs, I don't know that they have special needs, because I don't have a 504 on anybody that comes to visit, you know, my library. So it's good awareness to have just some things on hand, and then to be able to refer to it. So I'm going to work with Aaron, the library for the director for the school, to see how together maybe we can jointly do some things that would cross over for the school and for the public. That would, I think, is what I'm going to do next.
That sounds
Yeah,
great.
thanks. Yeah, thank you. I do want to be, I know that there's another session starting on the other track. Although pretty sure, hold on. I'm pretty sure there's not one on this track. No, there's not. So if Karen, if you're willing to stick around for a minute, there is at least another question in here, but we know if folks need to leave, that's totally fine. I don't know if you saw the one in the chat about sensitivity trainings.
Yeah, I don't have any in mind right now. I can certainly get back to you and do some research and get back to you on some that might be good. I think too, if you have a center for independent living, either in your region or your state, that they might be a great place to start and see if they have training available. Or they might have local resources that they can point you to for training. But if you want to connect with me afterward or put your email in the chat, I can do research for you and get back to you.
And there was one other question earlier. I believe someone was asking for, I think is when you were talking about the memorable times cafe.
Yeah.
And they were asking about a link, and I was kind of looking, is there a link for
There
that?
is.
That can be, okay, I did a bad job finding it, so.
I think actually that it's memorable times.
Maybe I was searching it incorrectly. I was searching in the Able site and wasn't seeing it.
This link is actually to memorable times online.
Oh, great, thank you.
But you can, if you click there up at the top, you can find a memory cafe in your area, and there's a resource library, so you can find more information on how to start one on your own.
Excuse me, was that for the older adult story hour thing? Or is
Sorry,
that I got
the memory cafe, that's for adults who have dementia.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do have the Next Club Book Club link in the slides.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Somebody else have any questions? Thanks for sticking around a little bit longer, Karen.
Sure, absolutely.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have
Yes.
a question from New Hampshire. We have a patron who is blind, and what you were saying about some of the Braille and audio resources really resonated. I think that they would be really good for him.
Mhm.
So do you have any like starter tips for a library whose collection does not currently have any Braille materials? Or how we can make our collection more accessible to him in the audiobook nook?
Well, my first recommendation would be to connect him with your Talking Books library in New Hampshire. Marilyn Stevenson is the director of that, and she's fantastic, and so is the library. I'm not sure if New Hampshire does, but I know here in Vermont, we contract with the Perkins School for the Blind, and they send our patrons Braille books.
Perkins School for the Blind. Okay.
Right.
Writing this all down.
Thank you.
Well, and
There's two of
Marilyn,
us.
Marilyn at the Talking Book Library in New Hampshire, she would be able to connect you with them, because if they do it through their Talking Book Library, then that's free for them, and they'll send those Braille books directly to their patrons in the mail.
Fantastic.
Got
All
it.
right. Thank you so much. This was really enlightening.
You're very welcome.
All right, thanks, Karen. Really appreciate it.
Mm.
That was fantastic.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us.